President, if I might, I'd like to acknowledge Majority Leader in the great work he's put forth on this I think important opportunity we have. I know the Majority Leader has some additional comments he'd like to make, but I tend to stay after the Majority Leader concludes and make my case once again for why this is so important.
Mr. President, through the chair to my friend from Colorado, he's talked about the work I've done on this. I haven't done much. He has been the leader of this, and I have been with him all the way. This is truly his issue. He's right. I have supported him from the very beginning, and I admire his resilience. Each time he brings this up, he's pushed back for some other reason. And personally, as I told him today, I'm to the point now where we're going to have a vote on this. There will be people come to me, why are you doing this? We're going to have a vote on this. The Democrats and Republicans are going to have to make a decision where they stand for American credit unions.
Mr. President.
Senior Senator from Colorado is recognized.
Mr. President, if I might, I'm going to expound on what the Majority Leader just shared with the body. And the whole point of what we're going to do on the Jobs Act is to expand access to capital for businesses across our great country. But the legislation that I've introduced on a bipartisan basis that also has a bipartisan twin in the House of Representatives is really aimed at truly small businesses. And I'd like to explain a little bit more about what I mean. And what we would do is, in effect, lift a regulation. We've talked a lot about deregulation in Washington, unleashing the creativity in our business sector. What this legislation would do is deregulate an industry that's really raring to go to help small businesses. Before I get into the specifics, I'd like to thank my Republican co-sponsors, who include Senators Olympia Snowe, Rand Paul, and Susan Collins. The legislation in the House has been introduced by Republican Ed Royce, with whom I served when I was a member of the House. And he has over 40 Republican co-sponsors in the effort over on the other side of the Capitol. So in sum, this is a bipartisan, common-sense way to create jobs and help our small businesses without costing taxpayers a dime. And when you add up the elements in what we're trying to do, there are positives across the board. Now, the reason this is so important is that there continues to be a phenomenon in this country, our country, where small businesses are starving for credit, but the federal government's standing in the way of them procuring that credit. As I said to start my remarks, I'm talking about the smallest of small businesses. These are the men and women who need $50, $100, maybe even $200,000 to move from their garage to a retail storefront, to renovate their sales floor, or to upgrade or purchase equipment. And in the process, they'll expand. And they just often, too often, frankly, are too small to be worth the time of banks, or they just don't fit the lending guidelines of a bank's corporate headquarters. But credit unions are standing there ready to lend money to these Americans to support their businesses and create jobs. Now, the leader just moved to the Jumpstart Our Business Startups Act. The acronym is the Jobs Act. That's appropriate. The House passed it last week. And this bill is aimed at increasing the availability of startup companies by expanding and easing the process of undergoing an IPO. An IPO, that's an acronym for Initial Public Offering. And that's a noble goal, especially as our economy still struggles to create jobs. But the problem is that we're still leaving small businesses behind. Why is that? Well, the Jobs Act is aimed at companies with revenue under $1 billion. Let me repeat that, billion with a B. These companies may well need help with an IPO, but I'm talking about offering relief to Main Street. And in light of this, I'm still committed, and I appreciate the Majority Leader's comments. I've been very persistent on this. I'm still committed to allowing credit unions to increase the amount of money they can lend to small businesses. And our bipartisan Small Business Lending Enhancement Act was the first amendment filed to this bill, and I still hold out hope that we'll find a way to include it in the bill. We ought to pass it immediately. We would see immediate results if we did so. Let me share a couple of examples of why I think this is so important, and they're Colorado-centric. I know the presiding officer makes a point to talk about his home state on an ongoing basis and to highlight Ohioans who make a difference. So let me talk about two small business owners in Colorado who made a difference with the help of credit unions. Stacy Hammond owns the First Street Saloon, I should say salon. I better get that straight, Mr. President. First Street Salon in Thornton. And Lisa Herman of Broomfield owns Happy Cakes Bake Shop in Denver's Highland Square. They were turned away from their banks. And in the breach, credit unions arrived and they lent to these two small business women. And they were able to grow their businesses and hire their fellow Coloradans to help them in those business enterprises. They didn't need a $1 billion IPO. They needed a small bridge loan. And we could be making a huge difference in many, many communities with mere pennies on the dollar of what the Jobs Act is focused on. Yet my amendment, were to be considered in this Jobs Act, would actually help small businesses directly create jobs. Credit unions, Mr. President, put simply, specialize in these small business loans. In fact, the Federal Reserve has told us that many banks have quit considering loans like theirs, under $200,000, because they aren't worth the bank's time. Credit unions know these small business owners, and they have money to lend to them. But unfortunately, federal law still limits the amount of small business loans a credit union can extend to these businesses to 12% of their assets. Over 500 credit unions nationally have had to stop or slow down their business lending because of this, I can't think of any other word, but strange federal limit on helping small businesses. It's hard to believe that. Government is telling these financial institutions that they can't help create jobs in their local communities. And that's why my bipartisan amendment would double the amount of money credit unions can offer to small businesses. Now, we've heard from the banks over the years that they think it's unfair that they have to compete with credit unions. But the fact is, it's not about banks or credit unions, it's about small businesses. And I have to say that these two different kinds of financial institutions serve very different small business populations. Credit unions serve the smallest of small businesses, who often must resort to their credit cards literally to invest in their businesses, keep their cash flow going, but in the process they create jobs. And these are business owners who've been by and large turned away by the banks. I'm not talking about taking business away from anyone. I'm suggesting that at the very least we let the credit unions loan to these small business owners that the banks don't want to do business with because they are too small. Now, credit unions have been in existence for over 100 years. And today they only represent about 5 to 6% of all small business loans. And even if they were to increase their lending, if credit union lending were to increase, their market share were to double as a result, they would still only have 7, 8, 9% of market share. Banks would have nearly 90% of the markets to themselves. Let me rebut another concern that's been expressed. The banks say that this proposal is unproven or somehow an unsound way of increasing small business loans. But as I said, the credit unions have been making small business loans since the early 1900s. And there weren't any limits on credit unions until 1998 on how much they could lend. The credit union sector has a regulator, the National Credit Union Administration, and it has endorsed lifting or even eliminating the small business lending cap. It just makes sense to do this, Mr. President. And I just can't believe we're going to let these squabbles between the banks and credit unions keep job creators from going to work in the small business sector. There's a rush to pass the Jobs Act, which would help billion-dollar companies with their IPOs. But how about we take a little bit of time to help small business owners like Stacy and Lisa by passing our bipartisan amendment? And after all, if we're going to tell the American people that this bill is about increasing access to capital. Let's start off by helping the small business owners on Main Street that really fuel our job engine. This is what we would do in Colorado. It's how we would apply our common sense approach to business. And I plead with my colleagues to consider the important effect this would have. So in sum, our bipartisan amendment is pro-jobs, it's deregulatory, and it wouldn't cost the taxpayers a dime. It would release $10 billion in capital across our country, and conservatively 100,000 new jobs would be a result. Let's take this up. Let's fuel the economic engine with capital of our small business sector. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.